Hello, and thanks for opening this special Behind the Ropes virtual tour of the Merchants House Museum in New York City. This is one of 3 video tours which examine this incredibly intact building, its original furniture collection, and the huge array of historic lighting devices once used when the museum was a private home in the 19th century. We will literally go behind the ropes, exploring aspects and areas of this unique landmark the public normally doesn't experience during an in-person visit. This will be very special. Please help us keep this magical building standing, intact, and open to the public for generations to come. Go to merchantshouse.org/support to make a donation. Any amount, large or small, really makes a difference. This link appears in the video description as well. On behalf of the staff, board of directors, volunteers, and the many admirers of this amazing survivor of old New York, I thank you. And now, on with the video. Among the hundreds of objects which the general museum-going public never gets to see is this tiny, seemingly insignificant candle. Back in the day, this was a burglar's horror. The Merchants House Museum, also known as the Seabury Treadwell Residence at 29 East 4th Street, is one of the great treasures of New York City. Why is this house a treasure? Simply because it exists. There is nothing else like this in the city of New York. Built in 1832 and home to the Treadwell family for almost 100 years, this house is intact, outside and inside, complete with the family's possessions, their furnishings, even their clothing. Stepping through that front door is like stepping into a time machine. The Merchants House Museum is known not only for its architectural integrity, so little has changed since this house was built in 1832, but also for the quality and completeness of the house's contents, reflecting the lives of wealthy merchants such as the Treadwell family, who lived here from 1835 until 1933 and left pretty much everything behind when their youngest and last surviving child, Gertrude, passed away in the house. The house's architecture tells us much about the attitudes and values of the era when it was built. The museum's collections tell us much about the people who lived in a house like this. Among the over 4,000 objects the Treadwells left behind are many lighting devices we still use in our homes today when we want to set an evocative mood. But nearly 2 centuries ago, the mood was one of basic necessity, simply trying to see after nightfall. And before that, it was one of basic survival. The Treadwells lived in an age of miracles, scientific and industrial. It's no exaggeration to say that many of the things we take totally for granted today were life-changing innovations in the 19th century. Artificial lighting was one of them. For as long as humankind existed, lighting was as basic as an open flame. First there was the sun and the moon, or lack thereof, then a lucky flash of lightning setting something ablaze that was carefully tended in order to keep the home fires, cave fires, burning. Gradually, humans learned techniques for starting their own blazes, including striking flints together to create sparks, and the ever-trusty scout trick of rubbing 2 pieces of dried wood together. But this wasn't easy, and keeping a fire burning was one of the things that often spelled the difference between survival and death. And what to do when the weather didn't accommodate and you needed light in the middle of a downpour. At one with the natural environment, humans came to recognize that wild rushes soaked in animal fat gave a strong, although brief, light. Rush lights. Certain resinous woods burned brighter and longer than softwoods, the first torches. They combined fatty substances, both from animals and oily plants, in shallow stone or pottery bowls, added fibrous wicks, the first lamps. By Roman times, the wealthy could afford long cylinders of hardened animal fat with a wick running through the center, the first candles. And there it pretty much stopped. Fires, torches, oil lamps, candles. Until the 1780s, humans were still lighting their homes basically the same way their ancestors in the Ice Age did. This all changed when François Argan, a Swiss-born chemist, introduced a revolution in lighting called the argon lamp in his honor. From that point on, artificial lighting changed forever. Argan devised a cylindrical wick through which air could flow on both surfaces, increasing the intensity of the light produced. A cylindrical chimney enhanced the airflow. Through intensive experimentation, he ultimately devised the right proportions for optimal output. A device for raising and lowering the wick permitted fine-tuning. The light was much brighter than a candle, burned cleanly, and was cheaper than candles. Argan's invention created a ripple effect. Specially trained lace makers were required to produce the right sort of wick. A special type of solder needed to be developed to withstand the heat of the intense flame. New types of heat-resistant glass needed to be developed, and whale oil was found to be the fuel most suited to the burner, expanding a small American industry into one that swept the world. His invention truly changed the way people lived. It is my supreme pleasure to introduce Carswell Rush Berlin, one of the world's foremost experts in early 19th century American furniture, with an additional specialization in 19th century lighting. This man is known throughout the world, and I'm happy to say that I've known him for the better part of my adult life. So, Carly?
Anthony, I'm thrilled to be back in the Merchant's House, and so happy that you asked me to talk about the wonderful collection of lighting here. We're going to start with these beautiful argand mantle garniture. That's argand, not argon. Argon is a gas that has nothing to do with these lamps. These are oil lamps that were made in the 1820s, probably in England, possibly in the United States. But ones of this quality are likely to have been made in Birmingham, England, which was the brass manufacturing center of England, and imported here. These are labeled on the burner by a firm called J&I Cox, which was a luxury emporium on Broadway. These are oil burners here that were invented by M.E. Argand. The burner principle, the burner was patented by him in 1784, and it consisted of a tubular wick surrounded by a metal tube, and in the center was another metal tube. So there were two tubes, and in the middle of which was a woven tubular wick. And this glass chimney was part of the patent. It was required, it was necessary in order to create the updraft of hot air once the wick was lighted, which would draw air in through the sides and through this air intake valve at the base, which would draw air up through the center of the wick and force oxygen into the ring of fire burning at the top of the wick. This would give you more thorough combustion and a brighter light, and it could be, the wick height could be adjusted by turning the chimney holder. So this took the work out of lighting in addition to being much brighter and longer lasting, because this wick was being fed by oil from this element of the lamp right here, which was the oil font. Right here, it looks like an urn with a little valve here at the base. And this would have to be filled probably on a nightly basis. This luster ring can be lifted off like this. I'm not going to do it completely, but I'm just going to show you how that works. You would lift off the oil ring, or your servants would, more particularly. You would unscrew the font, flip it over, open the valve, put in your oil, close the valve, put the font back on the lamp, and then open the valve back up so the oil could then flow out the fuel tubes to the burner. And then you would put your luster ring back on. The lusters are really there just for decoration and to reflect light. The more glittery and reflective they could be, the better. So that's what all this was about. But at the end of the day, all of this glitteriness, these cut glass bobèche, the lusters or prisms, the wonderful shape of the font, all this cutting on the shades, all that was window dressing. That had nothing to do with the invention itself, which was just the burner and the narrow glass chimney that fit over the burner. These are wonderful because they're in lovely original condition and they're intact. Here you have a complete mantle garniture set made about 1825, probably in England. This is a brass student lamp, and they were designed to burn colza oil, which is rapeseed oil, and typically in America, whale oil. So this is what all those whales died for. It has a long, thin chimney that fits tightly around the flame, which I will remove. The burner itself is this element here, and this is what Aimé Argand, who was a philosopher and inventor from Geneva, Switzerland, invented. There's the burner, and you can see it comes out. This is the oil font here, or the oil reserve, and that would be filled by removing it, filling it here, putting it back in, and then the oil would flow through through the fuel tube to the burner through force of gravity. The outer tube that held the wick would stop right here where the oil came in from the font. The center tube, in the center of the wick, went down to this element here, which is called a drip cup, which, I'm going to tip it forward, you can see has got holes in it. And those holes are vents or air intake valves. So when you lit your tubular wick, you put on, this is the wick riser, so that you could raise and lower the wick by turning the chimney holder. You lit your wick, which gave you sort of a ring of fire. Then you would put on the chimney. The fire of the wick would heat the air in the chimney, just like your flue in your chimney at home. This is simply to raise and lower the entire lamp on the brass standard. So you could bring it down, you could bring it up, and fasten it. My guess on the date of this is probably 1835. It started to dominate home lighting by about 1810 to about 1840. when gas lighting started to be introduced broadly in the United States.
After the argon lamp, things were, as they say, never the same. All subsequent oil-fueled lamps were based on some variant of his invention: a reservoir for the fuel, an adjustable burner that fed air to a wick, and the glass chimney to focus and enhance the flame. After argon's breakthrough, the aim of lamp manufacturers was to make their product more efficient and affordable. Whale oil was the best fuel source, but pricey, and it soon became apparent whales couldn't reproduce quickly enough to keep up with demand. Inventors experimented with various fuel sources. Colza oil, made from rapeseed, was a popular alternative to whale oil in Europe, which lacked a whaling industry sufficient to provide lighting fuel for the masses. Lard oil was another option. Very cheap, but who wanted their homes to reek of burnt pork fat? Coal oil, a precursor to kerosene, gave a poor quality light, very sooty and foul-smelling. Camphene seemed to do the trick. Camphene was the trade name of a purified spirit of turpentine. Camphene gives a very brilliant light, but to prevent smoking, a very strong draft was required. A typical camphene lamp has wick tubes forming a V with caps resembling thimbles to extinguish the flame and prevent evaporation. Burning fluid, as it was called, became a lighting fuel for the masses. In 1845, production of camphene was close to 200 million gallons compared to 18 million gallons for whale oil. A step forward without a doubt, not the least for those poor whales, although it did have a nasty tendency to explode. Along with lighting fuels, different materials for making the lamps themselves were explored. Bronze, silver, copper, brass, most metals other than tin and pewter were costly luxury items. America, however, had a burgeoning glass industry, and lamp bases were made of what we now call early American pressed glass. Cheap, very attractive, cheery, and colorful, these lamps were sold by the tens of thousands. Apparently, tin and glass whale oil or camphene lamps were too common for the Treadwells. There is not a single example in the museum collection. Bronze seems to have been the preference of Seabury Treadwell. He was clearly not afraid to spend money. Coal miners in England used open flame for light and were subject to occasional explosions. Clearly, the coal was emitting some sort of combustible gas. Was there a chance for additional profit by marketing the gas as well as the coal? In England, William Murdoch was the first to exploit coal gas for practical lighting. In 1792, he first lit his own house in Redruth, Cornwall. In 1798, he used gas to light the main building of the Soho foundry in Birmingham, and in 1802 lit the exterior in a public display of gas lighting that astonished the local population. Experimentation and refinements continued. Among the economic and cultural impacts of gas lighting were much longer work hours in British factories. Factories could even work continuously 24 hours a day, resulting in increased production, not to mention worsened working conditions. Gas lighting spread to other countries. Urban centers were lit with street lamps effectively for the first time. The night was never the same again. Another major change caused by gaslight was that the light source was now fixed in place. Fixtures. No longer was light portable. You couldn't bring the light to you. You now brought you to the light. This was a major change in how people functioned at home and at work. The use of gas lighting in Rembrandt Peale's museum in Baltimore in 1816 was a great success. In 1817, Baltimore became the first American city with gas streetlights. In March 1823, the newly incorporated New York Gas Light Company was granted the contract to make and lay cast iron pipes and supply the gas to light Broadway from Grand Street to the Battery. A gasworks was constructed at Center and Hester Streets, and the company, with 41-year-old Samuel Leggett as its president, prepared for the rush of clients, which didn't happen. The dangers of what was called burning air had been widely publicized. People believed the gas would result in explosions, death, and destruction. To prove that illuminating gas was both practical and safe, Leggett plumbed his house at 7 Cherry Street for gas. In September 1823, he held a reception in his fashionable house, brilliantly gas-lit. Newspapers said the event caused a commotion. A large crowd gathered, watched from a respectfully safe distance at an illuminated mansion from which came no flames, according to Robert E. Livingston. They waited for the explosion, which never came. The demonstration was a sensation, and orders from the trendsetters began coming in. And so, in 1825, Broadway below Grand Street became the first street in New York City lit completely with gas. In 1826, the New York Gas Light Company installed 2,400 light posts below Canal Street. In 1833, the Manhattan Gas Light Company plumbed the city further north. New York's streets were adequately lit for the first time in history, and thousands of homes followed suit. Apart from the obvious fire hazards, which were common to every form of open flame lighting, another problem of manufactured gas lighting was the gas works that mushroomed throughout the city. Huge factories with tremendous gas storage tanks taking up several city blocks loomed over many neighborhoods. The Treadwells had the 4th Street house plumbed for gas in 1855 and chose to provide for overhead lighting in the double parlors, the family room on the basement level, and the rear master bedroom. Installed gas outlets between the windows in the other 3 large bedrooms, added gas outlets in each of the 3 small bedrooms, and also in the kitchen, server's pantry, and hallway on the ground floor. Their gas was manufactured in a tremendous gas house district located around 14th Street on the East River. A Con Ed substation still exists there to this day. Overhead in these magnificent double parlors are the gas fixtures to end all gas fixtures, at least as far as the merchant's house is concerned. They installed these 2 magnificent bronze gasoliers, which is simply a chandelier to burn gas. Fantastically ornate, massively heavy, clearly expensive, showy, and with 6 burners on them, they would have been blindingly bright, the equivalent of maybe 90 watts today. The fixtures are operated on what's called a water slide. If you notice, the pole descending down from the ceiling, of course, is fixed. It's a tube, since gas has to be piped through it. But the gasoliers are also designed to be able to be raised and lowered, both to adjust where the light was and for easier access to them when they needed to be cleaned, which was frequent. So you didn't need a ladder in order to clean the shades, the burners, the mechanisms, and just simply to dust them. This water slide was simply a tube within a tube with rubber O-rings dividing them and a column of water in between the 2 tubes, so there was no way the gas could escape. And then those pendants hanging off of chains and those wonderful pulley wheels at the top of the fixtures are counterweights, so you could raise and lower the gasolier practically effortlessly. I remember as a child in my parents' house, we had a similar light fixture. It was electric, of course, but I used to love to play with it all the time because you could raise and lower it, and there was a counterweight within the mechanism so that it would just glide up and then glide back down, until, of course, I broke it. There is a family tradition which justifies the fear people had in the 19th century of illuminating gas. Supposedly, one night, the gasolier in the rear parlor burst into flames, and one of the Treadwell boys was able to put out the fire and remove the gasolier basically pull it down from the ceiling. Whether or not this is true, when the gasoliers were conserved and cleaned about 10 years ago, it was discovered that the gasolier in the rear parlor had undergone some sort of a fire. There were scorch marks on the metal of the gasolier. And when the house was bought as a museum in the 1930s, the rear gasolier was found consigned to the attic. So it had been taken down and stored away for many decades before it was put back in its place of honor. You'll also note on the rear gasolier that the finial at the bottom has been modified. There's a little stopcock on it. So there's the 6 lights plus a 7th stopcock, which would allow gas to pass through the bottom of the fixture. That tells us that at some point the Treadwells had a gas lamp which was connected to the gasolier by a rubber hose, so they could have gas on the rear table in case they were using it for reading or work at night, or just wanted a simpler meal with just the gas lamp in the middle of the table. One of the things that always amazes me about gas lights in general is how wobbly and fragile they appear. When you think that there was an open flame being fed by gas running through this pipe and exposed just inside this glass globe, it seems almost frightening to me that this should be so wiggly in its base. Now granted, it does have a few years behind it, but still extremely economical use of material, considering the danger we, as modern people, would associate with this. I guess the moral of that story is people back in the day appreciated fire and knew how to take better care when flame was involved. This gas light in the study is a particularly interesting one simply because it's never been electrified. It's intact. And if we had gas running through the pipes today, in theory, it would still work. It illustrates everything we need to know about the standard gas light. Here, where the pipe and the lamp itself connect, is what we call the stopcock. This is a simple valve which opens and closes the gas. Here, just below the jet itself, is a more complicated mechanism. There are 2 different levers on it, which are designed to adjust the height of the flame, the amount of gas which is coursing through the jet, and regulating the air that's mixed with the gas. So this particular gas burner is quite advanced. You could really get some variations in light out of it. Most of the other gas burners in the house have been converted to electricity. Today, this one remains intact. And with the relative complexity of the mechanism itself, it tells us something about the nature of this room and the multiple levels of light that were needed specifically in this small space. The pair of gas lamps situated in the pier between the 2 windows in Mr. Treadwell's room are particularly interesting. Very masculine, very strong looking. They have an interesting double swing to them, so they're very versatile. Certainly would have made it easier to see your morning ablutions. It's unlikely that Mr. Treadwell shaved himself. He probably went to a barber for that. But in a pinch, he certainly could have touched up a little bit. And the shades are especially nice on this pair because they have a Greek key motif on them. Very appropriate for a house of this classical appearance. Of course, as you can see, they've been electrified now. But even with the electric cord running through them, there is still a certain amount of flexibility, adjustability, if you will, to the arms. Very practical, very good looking. One of the things I find most delightful about 19th century decorative arts is its whimsy. For example, this pair of gaslight tiebacks, indeed, gaslights that were intended to act as tiebacks for curtains. Now, to us today, it seems asking for trouble to have an open flame so near flammable materials, fabrics. But one can only assume in the 19th century people understood fire better because it was a part of them in every room in their house. Basically, they're still here and the house is still here. They're so delightful. Morning glories of blown glass with a wonderful gilt detail to them, and then the lamp fixtures themselves are a gilt bronze with morning glory leaves tied up in a bow, wonderful highlights of gilt so they would sparkle, a burner at the end of the stamen or pistil, I'm never sure which is which. It wouldn't have been a very bright flame, but it would have definitely been a flame, and it would have illuminated the area around the mirror and the washstand. Just delightful. Well, as they say, necessity is the mother of invention, and there certainly seemed to be a lot of inventive thinking taking place in the 19th century. A lot of it circling around lighting. Here's an example from the museum collection, which was a mystery for decades. People knew it had something to do with gas, but they didn't know what until one of our researchers found a period print which showed it in use. It's a gas extender. You hooked this end into an overhead gas jet. The gas traveled down the pipe. You have a stopcock here to turn it on and off. And then here was your flame. Now, it couldn't have been blindingly bright, but it would have sufficed for reading a book or working on some close work on a table way down below a gasolier. And it allowed you to use gas from one jet instead of 6. I don't know. They seem to have such a cavalier attitude with open flames in the day. It seems to me like they were playing with fire. Clearly, Seabury and Eliza Treadwell, and very likely all their contemporaries, considered gaslight as only one of several alternatives for lighting their homes. For one thing, a natural gas industry was already in its fledgling stage. In 1821, at Fredonia in Chautauqua County, New York, William Hart dug a well to a depth of 27 feet into gas-bearing shale, then drilled a borehole an additional 43 feet, and piped the natural gas to a nearby inn where it was burned for illumination. Soon many gas wells were drilled in the area, and the natural gas-lit streets of Fredonia became a tourist attraction. But it would be many decades before natural gas superseded that made from coal. The Treadwells continued to use their oil lamps as well. When the argand lamps in the front parlor were first wired for electricity in the 1930s, the reservoirs still contained whale oil. In 1859, 4 years after the Treadwells introduced gas lighting into their home, deposits of thick, foul, black liquid were discovered in western Pennsylvania. An oil rush was on, and there was money to be made with a new lighting fuel: kerosene. With the development and marketing of kerosene, another revolution in lighting took place. Clean burning, largely odor-free, very bright, very affordable, kerosene became the lighting choice in every corner of the world. Between it and gas lighting, it seemed the ultimate had been reached, and kerosene was completely portable, so every corner of a home could be lit as needed.
This is an airflow lamp, but later in the 19th century, it's clearly a kerosene-based lamp. This is the font or the oil reserve. There would have been a wick that hung down into that. And argand in the beginning of the 19th century, taught everyone about the importance of these glass chimneys, which are part of his patent, and allows for the draw of the air, because the air heats up inside the chimney and rises and sucks air in through the air vents down here and up here. This little button is to raise and lower the wick. And I'm just going to disassemble this because I think it's interesting. This, by the way, would need to be cleaned on a regular basis. And again, as we've discussed, this is another exercise in adaptation. Here is a Sheffield silver candlestick that could accommodate a candle, or subsequently, as these things were developed, a kerosene burner.
Oh, so it was like a rope wick, a cord wick.
That's what I think. The design of the font tells us that it's a kerosene lamp, not a whale oil burning argand. The basic design of the whole lamp suggests that to us.
So because one sees a cylinder, one could be fooled into thinking it's an argon burner, and it's not.
Correct. Well, you can see all the little holes that were to introduce air that was sucked in from beneath inside the chimney, so that air was flowing up like an injection engine. It was giving you a more thorough combustion and therefore a brighter flame. We're now in the kitchen, where we have a display of various lighting devices and an early oil can, which I don't think I have ever seen. So that's rather wonderful. So the oil could be directed more specifically into the fonts of various oil lamps. That's a wonderful artifact from the middle of the 19th century. I want to talk about these two lamps here. The one on the right is obviously a column with an ionic capital, and it has a label of Cornelius and Company of Philadelphia, and a font that would have been used originally as a solar lamp, but has now been converted to kerosene. So this is a kerosene burner with a flat wick. So that's not the original burner, but again, it shows us the way families adapted to newer technology and newer fuel. This lamp I like because it retains its original matte and burnished lacquer finish, which we have talked about here on other lamps. You can see that the column is matte, and then here at the top there's a band of burnished brass, and then the curves of the capital are burnished, and so forth. That's what made these things beautiful. They were both matte and burnished together. If it were all matte or all burnished, it wouldn't have the same beautiful effect. But anyway, so it's nice, and it's rare to see this original surface. There would be a patent date on that little label, but it's abraded in such a way that I can't really read it. But it probably dates to between 1843 and 1848. The lamp on the left here is really very grand indeed. This is undoubtedly an import from England, and has now been again converted to kerosene. And you can see here the top has two flat wicks which burned kerosene, and here you can see the two wick riser buttons for raising and lowering the wicks. And it also has a mechanism here for extinguishing the wicks. That's what that little lever is for. And this This obviously is for holding the glass shade, but I believe that, that this was a later edition designed to hold the original Sonumber shade for this lamp. Because they already had the shade, they didn't need to buy a new shade, but they needed a new way of holding the old shade on the new burner. So they had this thing made in order to hold the old shade on, which ordinarily would have sat on the Sonumber font, which was sort of a flattened donut shape that would have sat right here. The problem with the original design of argand lamps was that the font was to the side of the burner and was above the burner so that the oil would flow through force of gravity to the burner. So this would have been the font, this would have been the burner. The problem is that, that if this is where your light is being created, any kind of urn to hold the oil would block the light to some ever-increasing percentage of the room as it got further and further from the burner. So the idea with a Sonumber lamp was to create a font that didn't block the light, hence the name Sonumber, without shade or without shadow. So the font itself was designed to go around the burner, and it was sort of a flattened donut, and where you would pour the oil in and it would feed through two tubes to the burner. And the idea was that there was a hole in the middle and nothing to block the light, so the light would flow straight down and straight out in 360 degrees. Subsequently, when they developed the solar lamp was also an argand burner, but they had figured out how to burn less expensive fuel in a solar lamp. And they had the burner with wicks that went into the font in the same way that the kerosene lamps did. But the concept was, again, that the font would be not blocking the light that was emanating from the flame. So that's what you're seeing here. Again, another interesting adaptation of an older technology adapted for a new technology, the kerosene font and burner. But this is really wonderful. This also would have had this same matte and burnished lacquered brass surface. Someone obviously has attempted to polish this with brass polish, which is sort of a disaster because it ruins any of the old lacquer that would have originally been on this. But you can see how much effort and care was taken originally in decorating these shafts. The background would have been matte, and then the vines and their leaves and the grapes would have been burnished. But anyway, a really grand base.
This unique lamp is one you'll probably never see anywhere else. It's called a Caravanian lamp after the inventor, and he devised a system in which a clockwork mechanism in the base would send a slight breeze using a rotary fan up through the interior of the lamp, sending a steady current of air through the wick and up through the top of the lamp. There were a lot of devices, a lot of gimmicks for lamps in the day. People were always looking for something new and improved, and this was something which didn't quite catch on. But what it eliminated was the need for a chimney in the middle of the lamp. Rather than having the chimney create a current that would force the air past the wick, this had this little wind-up key on the side and allowed a current of air to go right through the middle of the lamp. It's a very interesting lamp, extremely rare. Let's take a quick look at it. The shade, the upper ring comes off. This is there just simply to support the shade. Here is a burner, which lifts apart. This is a diffuser which fits inside the base of the urn, where on another kind of a lamp this would have been filled with oil. A very light breeze just comes up around this and is diffused. And if you look underneath, here you see that mechanism. The clockwork device, which runs a little rotating fan, sending air through the middle of it. If you look closely at the body of the lamp, you can see evidence that it at one time had matte and shiny brass finishes on it, long since gone. But there is evidence for this having once existed. You can see it particularly in the top of the urn, where you see darker rings which would have once been very shiny. This is similar and probably inspired by another type of lamp called a Carcel lamp, which also had a clockwork mechanism in the base, but it was designed to pump oil up into the burner. So it was like a little clockwork, like the way wind-up toys are, little clockwork mechanism that would send oil at a steady stream up into the burner. So you could avoid the necessity to have a gravity-fed fuel source. It was a way of getting the fuel underneath the burner instead of off to the side, the way you see in an argon burner. So this is just a very, very unusual lamp that you will only see right here at the merchant's house. There are many options for lighting a home by the mid-19th century, but the difference in cost could be substantial.
What did it cost to light a room? Camphene, or burning fluid, cost 50 cents a gallon. Whale oil cost between $1.30 and $2.50 a gallon. Lard oil was 90 cents a gallon, and it was poor quality and very smelly. Kerosene, derived from petroleum, cost about 60 cents a gallon. In 1862, to help fund the Union Army, the U.S. put a tax on all alcohol products. Camphene was included. By the end of the war, the price of burning fluid was $4 a gallon. Kerosene, derived from petroleum, was not taxed. This spelled the end of camphene as a lighting fuel, and thousands of lamps were retrofitted with kerosene burners. Candlelight remained a viable option in the 19th century as well. Witness the numerous, mostly English-made candle holders in the house today. Several manufacturing processes had been perfected, and candles were no longer made of smelly animal fat, which could melt in hot weather and also served as a food source for vermin, but now were made of synthetic waxes with delicious scents added. Decorative colors could be used as well. The wicks, too, were perfected so they were self-consuming. It was no longer necessary to trim or snuff the wicks as the candles burned down. Snuffing was considered a terrible nuisance. It seemed a wick needed trimming every few minutes, but it was necessary to prevent long burnt wicks from falling into the wax, causing guttering, smoking, and uneven burning. If your snuffing skills weren't the best, the flame itself was often extinguished. Hence, today, when you snuff a candle, it means to put it out, rather than trim the wick.
Apparently, the Treadwells were fond of candlelight, even though it was impractical, old-fashioned, and relatively expensive. So much for all those romantic made-for-TV movies with rooms ablaze with hundreds of candles. There are various examples of candle-powered lighting fixtures, both decorative and practical, in the house. Many can be seen in the family room and rear parlor, both of which were used for dining.
One advantage of candlelight was its attractiveness. Silver and crystal table services glittered, and ladies' jewelry at formal events never looked better than by candlelight, nor, for that matter, did the ladies themselves. Candlelight can be very flattering. Candlelit tables became a matter of romantic choice and have remained so ever since. Rarely are we closer to our ancestors than during a candlelit holiday meal, especially when traditional old family recipes and table settings handed down through generations are featured.
Well, we finally come to these wonderful set of girandoles. These are made of brass. It's a mantle garniture set, so it would be typical on a sideboard or specifically on a mantelpiece. These were probably made in the United States. There were at least 6 firms that made these here in the United States in the middle of the 19th century. Most of them date between 1840 and 1860. They were made by Archer and Warner and Cornelius in Philadelphia. They were made here in New York by Dietz and Company and Star Fellows. In Boston, they were made by William Shaw and by Henry Hooper. One of the wonderful things about these is that so often they are lacking their original surface. These maintain their original surface, which is rare because the surface is actually lacquered. They look like gilt bronze, they look like they're covered in gold, but in fact there's no gold on them at all. The finishing involved dipping the brass into an acid solution, which rendered the brass, it pitted the brass, and made a brass a matte lemony yellow. Then a skilled person would go in and burnish the areas that they wanted to highlight, the little glinty, shiny areas, like the stripes on her skirt, or the edge of her shoe, or this lapel on Paul's jacket, or some of the veins on the leaves. They would burnish them, and then the entire thing would be lacquered, which would maintain the matte and burnished surface. And what's happened over time to many of these, sadly, is that the lacquer has, either through mistreatment or through natural erosion, simply fallen away. These are additionally special because they came in metal bases, they came in a single marble plinth, or in this case, sort of the deluxe version, they came with a double plinth with this cast brass element in between. So that was sort of the most expensive version of these girandoles that you could buy. So these are not only the top of the line girandoles, but they also remain in wonderful condition. These were obviously meant to be stationary, unlike many simple candle holders that could be carried from room to room, as had been done for a millennium. These were designed to be put on your mantle or possibly on your sideboard and left there. They were not mobile. They didn't all have this motif. They had many, many different motifs. This is Paul and Virginie, which was based on a novel by Bernardin de Saint-Pierre from the late 18th century. The Romantic period became very popular in the United States. Well, Anthony, here we are in the objects storage space. I'm very privileged to be here. I've never been in this space, though I've been in this house many, many times. So this is a treat for me to see things here beautifully stored in acid-free boxes, which is exactly how they should be stored. And we're going to look at a few of these early lamps, and I'm just going to actually unpack them right in front of you. Make sure that's properly balanced so it doesn't come crashing down. This is a candle-powered device dating to the middle of the 19th century. This is a reflector, which I'll put aside for a second. This is part of the reflector that's come off. And then this is the fixture itself. It's made of brass. It's a candle-powered device. There's the bottom. And here's the fixture itself. And this fixture works by inserting a candle into these tubes, and each of these tubes has a spring that you can see right here. So the candle would go down, and then these caps would hold the candle down, and the spring would force the candle towards the top. And the idea was that it wouldn't be dripping, the candle wouldn't be dripping, and the burn would be controlled, and so that you didn't have to always tend to the candle and snuff the candle because of these caps on top, which kept the candle down and only let the wick protrude. So this was an idea that was patented by a guy named Palmer in London about 1830. So these are called Palmer patents. But it turns out that this particular version of Palmer's patent with the reflector, which would have been applied to the piece like this, this part of it was made by a guy named Miller, and this is actually marked right on the on this element, and it says Miller's, and on this one, which has come loose, it says London. So here is the Miller's London Palmer patent lamp fully assembled. I would say the date is mid-19th century, 1850, 1860, 1870.
So they were still using candles.
Yes, they were still using candles. Candles continued to be popular through the 19th century, even though there were many other light sources. After fluid lamps were developed, people continued to use candles because they were handy. They were easy. They were a technology that everybody was familiar with. Anthony, here's another lamp that I think we should look at. Again, beautifully packaged for preservation purposes. Acid-free tissue. This is a big one. This rather wonderful thing is, just like the one we saw a minute ago, a Palmer patent lamp. But this one actually was made by Palmer, and Mr. Palmer's label is right there, Palmer patent, and there's a little coat of arms and the word patent. So this is the real thing, with a wonderfully cast brass base, and this is where the candle would go. It would be held down by this cap, and this one was fitted with a fixture for holding, instead of a reflector, a glass shade. But this one has been electrified, unfortunately. But that is damage that could be easily fixed with a donation. But and the brass casting of the base has lost its original matte and burnished lacquer surface. But again, that could also be restored down the road. But this is a wonderful thing, and I think it may be the first time I've ever actually seen a Palmer patent lamp with Palmer's own label on it. Wonderful. With regard to the electrification, from a historian's point of view, it's too bad, but I think it's revealing of the fact that many light fixtures from the 19th century, as improvements were made in technology and in fuel, that these fixtures were upgraded typically by the people who owned them, so they could have the latest and greatest in technology and in better and brighter and easier lighting. So this is unfortunate, but very typical.
How does it affect value?
With respect to value, I don't think it affects it dramatically because it's something that can be reversed, and this hole can be soldered over, and would become invisible. If the lamp is largely intact, as this one is, I think it really retains most of its value. I mean, things do happen to antiques over time. They get broken, they get fixed, they get modified, as in the case of the lamps. But these, as long as the lamp is fully intact, then those small modifications can be reversed, and a value is not dramatically affected.
What about the red color of the shaft? Is that unusual?
Well, to be honest with you, I've never seen a Palmer patent lamp. So I suspect that this was the kind of thing that was chosen by the customer. You could probably get this same lamp in different colors, would be my guess. They didn't all come in red. You could probably buy them in whatever color you wanted. Could well have been bought in New York. There were certainly luxury emporiums that sold fine European goods, particularly lighting and porcelain and gilt bronze and decorative objects. And this could well have come from one such emporium like J&I Cox or Baldwin Gardner, for example. Probably made between 1840 and 1850. That would be my guess.
Among the hundreds of objects which the general museum-going public never gets to see is this tiny, seemingly insignificant candle. Today we would probably consider this a votive light candle or a little tea light, a little bit bigger than that. But back in the day, this was a burglar's horror. Trademark. Note well, no water required. This little candle tells us so much about the times. If you went out for the night, you would leave a little candle like this. The bottom of it is plaster. Place it in a dish for extra safety. No water needed because of the plaster base. And you could let it burn all night while you were away.
Samuel Clarke, a British manufacturer, brilliantly devised the plaster-bottomed pyramid candle, burglar's horror, as a safe alternative for low-level overnight illumination in homes, called night lights, replacing earlier squat candles requiring a saucer of water in which to burn safely when unattended. He marketed this candle as both a security device and the best candle to use with the hugely popular fairy lamps he patented in 1885, a decorative glass dish covered with a dome. He therefore promoted both the lamp, which originally featured an embossed fairy on its base, and the candle to be burned within. Glass manufacturers on both continents followed suit, and the market for fairy lamps in many different styles, even chandeliers, lasted well into the 1920s, ultimately displaced by the electric night lights we still use today. A less expensive ceramic dish was also marketed as an alternative to the art glass lamps. For whatever reason, neither dish nor lamp is in the museum's collection today, just this solitary candle. The burglar's horror was an excellent substitute for overhead bell-jar hanging lanterns, which were difficult to use. There were at least 2 of them in the merchant's house. Although they burned safely and gave adequate light, whether their source was candle, floating wick in oil, or small lamp, they were very inconvenient to access, especially in a house with soaring ceilings, like the Treadwells. In a household with only female servants in voluminous skirts, it would have been very difficult to climb the very tall ladder needed to light the bell-jar lanterns on a regular basis.
The faint glow of this one candle power light was enough to tell people on the street that someone was home. And so the horrified burglar would run to another house to break in. Can you imagine what light levels were like on the streets of New York when this was considered sufficient to keep the burglars at bay? In fairness, we must give credit to the household servants who kept the house humming and its contents in tip-top condition. Lamp cleaning would have been a routine, laborious and messy, any servant would have dreaded.
What about matches? There are historical references to something resembling matches in China, basically sulfur applied to the end of a pine splinter. An early friction match was made by François Deronne in 1816. His crude match was called a briquet phosphorique, a sulfur-tipped match to be scraped inside a tube coated internally with phosphorus. It was both inconvenient and unsafe. The first successful friction match was invented in 1826 by John Walker, an English chemist and druggist from Stockton-on-Tees, and he began manufacturing them. Each box was supplied with a piece of sandpaper folded double through which the match had to be drawn to ignite it. Walker named the matches Congreves in honor of the inventor and rocket pioneer Sir William Congreve. However, they remained dangerous, and flaming balls sometimes fell to the floor, burning carpets and dresses. In 1830, Frenchman Charles Sauria introduced phosphorus matches, kept in airtight metal boxes. They were very popular and went by the name of Locofoco in the U.S. Unfortunately, match factory workers developed phossy jaw and other bone disorders. There was enough white phosphorus in one pack to kill a person. Deaths and suicides from eating the heads of matches became frequent. Safety matches, in which the match must be struck against a specially prepared surface to light, as we see today, didn't appear until near the end of the 19th century. What did the servants use? Naturally, the household servants didn't enjoy the same opulent lifestyle as their employers, but lighting was one of the great equalizers. They lit their humble quarters basically the same way the Treadwells did theirs, only their devices were much humbler in look and materials. And no gas lighting for them.
Seabury Treadwell passed away in his bed in March of 1865, about a month before Lincoln's assassination. Although we have a number of lighting fixtures in the collection manufactured after this date, they all burn kerosene. Apparently, the Treadwells had no use for the newfangled light bulb Mr. Edison introduced.
On September 4th, 1882, the electrical age began. That day, Thomas Edison flipped the switch on his power station on Pearl Street, providing electricity to homes at a price comparable to gas. By the end of the month, they had 59 customers. Edison didn't invent electric light. Electric arc lamps were known as far back as the 1820s, and many inventors worked throughout the century to develop a viable electric light. But his determination, not to mention overwhelming savage business practices, resulted in Edison successfully introducing the first practical electric light for home use. Although electric lighting eventually won out, it took quite a while to vanquish the competition. Firstly, it required complicated installation, so was not readily available everywhere. It was well into the 20th century before it was common in many rural areas. Secondly, it was unreliable at first. Blackouts were common, and many homes continued to keep illuminating gas long after they also installed electric lighting. Combination gas-electric lamps were common for decades. Thirdly, many people were perfectly content with the tried and true, especially in the case of inexpensive, reliable, familiar kerosene. Apparently, the Treadwells fit this last category. It seems that electricity was introduced into the 4th Street home in only limited areas, and not until about 1926, long after Gertrude Treadwell became the last surviving member of the original Treadwells. In fact, the remaining Treadwells were so comfortable with the house, as Papa wanted it, that they remained living in their palatial home long after all their neighbors had abandoned the Bond Street area, which had by then become a skid row, and moved uptown. When the youngest and last remaining Treadwell child, Gertrude, passed away in 1933, her second cousin, George Chapman, decided to honor the family, the era, and a way of life totally vanished everywhere else in New York City by opening the house to the public as a museum. While sorting through 100 years of a family's occupancy, he discovered not only that he needed to install electricity throughout the house, but also introduce central heat and even modern bathrooms. The house had remained that lost in time.
The next time you flick on a light as evening settles around your home, give a quick nod to the inventors and dreamers who imagined that one day you would be able to so easily have light where there was none. And think back 100,000 years to your ancient ancestors who would be so jealous that you, unlike them, aren't left in the dark. See what I mean?
The Merchant's House Museum's Behind the Ropes series consists of in-depth examinations of the original architecture, furniture, and lighting fixtures in the museum's collections. These tours bring you to spaces and show you things the general visitor never sees as we explore the values, hopes, and lives of the wealthy families who lived in homes like these. I invite you to watch all 3 Behind the Ropes tours to see and experience the Merchant's House Museum in ways the general public doesn't. I hope you enjoyed your tour behind the ropes, way behind the ropes. To learn more about the house, its 100 years as a home, how it became a museum and was saved from destruction to become Manhattan's first landmark, purchase these books by Museum Historian Emeritus Mary Knapp, available on our website, merchantshouse.org. Be sure to tell your friends and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Merchant's House. And please consider making a donation or joining as a member or becoming a volunteer. Visit the website for information. It is nothing short of a miracle that the Merchant's House survives. With your help, we will maintain that miracle. Thank you.